Hey, well, welcome everyone. It's good to see everyone joining us today. I'm Jim Karinji with Dr. Chase Begay, the organizers of this academic health department seminar. Today, we are very, very lucky to have Dr. Julie Elledge from Wyoming, who is going to talk to us about the treatment of trauma in veterans in a very, very unique way that has some efficacy behind it. And Julie, I'll let you take it from here and tell us about yourself in the presentation as usual. We'll have some time for questions. So thank you so much, Dr. Elledge, for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much, Jim and Damien, for inviting me to be here. I could not be more thrilled to be here today and talk to you about trauma-informed coaching. So my credentials, I have a PhD in education, but I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist and have been a trauma-informed therapist for over 30 years and a coach for over 20 years. And so I have 3 board certifications credentials in coaching, including ICF's MCC, which is the highest credential in coaching. There's only about 2,000 of us in the world. So what we're going to talk about today, let me go ahead and get my presentation here up for you. All right, so we are going to talk about unlocking the mind's power to heal through storytelling. Now, it's interesting because in some ways this is very innovative, and in some ways it is the most ancient form of the mind's ability to heal. So we have a very unique take on coaching and trauma-informed coaching and how we apply this. So in our journey today, we are going to talk, we're not going to talk about the challenge. We are not going to do that, but we are going to define trauma-informed coaching. We're going to talk about the elements of story, narrative template, memory formation, and then the denouement. Now that sounds a little boring, but hopefully I can bring that to life for you. I wanted to first share with you that our program has won lots of awards. So our program, Veterans Talking to Veterans, is an application of Mentor Agility's trauma-informed coaching certification, which is credentialed by both the International Coaching Federation and the National Board for Health and Wellness Coaching. So what is coaching? Well, let's first of all talk about what it's not. It's not therapy, it's not counseling, and it's not peer-to-peer. And these are common mistakes that it's normal, because this is why story is so powerful, is to take what you know in one area and apply it to the other. And so a lot of times people assume, oh, that's therapy or it's peer-to-peer. So let's just distinguish them a little bit so we know specifically where on the mental health map that this falls. So in therapy, we always assess, diagnose, and treat dysfunction. As counselors, we give professional assistance in helping people cope, giving a very high level, obviously. And peer-to-peer specialists, a lot of times in particular, people think that we're peer-to-peer because it's called Veterans Talking to Veterans. But we are not this either, which is to promote recovery by sharing their own story. So me as a peer-to-peer specialist would share my story as a modality of addressing recovery. All these are very important avenues. And for coaching, we bring something different. We are partnering with clients, but our main goal is to inspire and maximize clients' personal or professional potential. So it is more focused on potential. So trauma, how does trauma play a role in this? I'm sure many of you are aware it's a psychological wound, shock, or injury that develops in response to experiencing an emotionally traumatic event that overwhelms the person's or the group's capacity to emotionally digest that experience. And we're going to talk a lot about that today. And it can be a single event or a series of events. So I'm going to give you a brief ICF definition. And that is coaches partner with clients in a thought-provoking and creative process that inspires them to maximize their personal and professional potential. So coaches are generalists. They're not experts in terms of health and wellness or executive coaching. They have a general set of skills that then are almost like a chameleon that come in and can be applied to a certain group. At the end of the day, the expertise of the coach is to stimulate that person's creativity, their own capacities to heal. We do not come in and heal the person, but we create an environment in which a person can heal or grow and move forward. Now, this is where we're a little bit different than a lot of organizations that are trauma informed. Trauma is we view trauma as a normal adaptive process to the environment. Most people will experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. And that traumatic event, when it happens to them, will disrupt their normal motivation, performance, or goal achievement. And that is the role of the coach, is to stimulate their intrinsic motivation, performance, and goal achievement. Coaching also helps people adjust from one stage in life to another, or one stage in their professional career to another. So when we experience a trauma, if you've ever walked on up to somebody who's in the midst or just witnessed, for example, hurricane take away their home, and you say, "What happened?" They're likely going to go, They're going to struggle to be able to tell you what just happened. And that is because the broke up area of the brain is freezing or significantly slowed down. And why that's important is because it is related to the voice, to our ability to speak. So that part of the brain is actually freezing. And that's why our choice and our voice are both frozen in that moment. And when you experience a psychological response to shock, 20% of people have negative response. As a matter of fact, everybody has negative and positive responses to a traumatic event. But 20% are going to have a more serious response and will require some sort of therapeutic, or they would be significantly helped by a therapeutic focus because they develop a mood disorder, an anxiety disorder in response to that event. But 80% have a positive response, and their functioning is fine. They don't really qualify as a mental illness. They don't fit that diagnostic criteria, and they go on to actually develop more coping skills. So coaching is a client-driven process. So the objective is to restore voice and choice and focus on somebody's potential. And then we have this unique perspective of using storytelling. That does not mean that we ask the individual to tell their story. The risk of asking somebody to tell their story is that you can trigger them. If you go, "What happened to you?" Because now the mind may not be able to take care of itself. And as a therapist, we are trained, trauma-informed therapists are trained to work with people and keep their minds safe as you do this work. But as in coaching, when we use storytelling, it creates a psychological distance, and the story itself asks the hard questions. And the stories challenge the maladaptive thinking or emotions that interfere with peak performance. So me as the coach am not digging around and asking those questions. The stories are asking those questions, which allows the individual or the groups to take care of themselves and present what they want to and share what they want to share. The other thing is it opens up people's perspective of how they're thinking about a situation. And so it supports their emotional and cognitive processing. And then it inspires their creative problem solving as well. And why this is so effective is because the mind thinks in story with the beginning, middle, and end. So let's take a look at that. So we know elements of a story: character, theme, conflict, setting, and plot. So let's take a little look at what that looks like. Characters. There's characters in the stories, and then there's characters in your own story. And then there's themes. What is your goal? And there's usually a few in particular common goals that you will see in fairy tales and myths and all stories, that the protagonist starts out in the ordinary world pursuing a treasure, a cure, the keys to the kingdom, the love of a prince or a princess. But the question is, why is the protagonist pursuing those goals? And this is where we come up with really the theme. So we have the theme of the goal, but then there's also a wound that drives that goal. Now, I don't see everybody here in this room opening their pocketbooks and writing a check for cancer and HIV and all these, different opportunities to give of yourself. But you may do that for one. And why do you do it for that one? And chances are that you are contributing to that organization or that need in this world because you have a personal experience with it. So if you're pursuing treasure, it's likely that underneath it all, there's a sense of financial well-being, that you believe that that treasure is going to solve that problem. Otherwise, why would you go pursue treasure? We're not all treasure hunters here. Because in some way, my perception that I'm not okay financially, or I'm pursuing a cure because either I have health problems or somebody that I love is ill, or the love of a prince or a princess. What better way to prove your self-worth than to be able to say, a prince or a princess loves me, therefore I am worthy? Or why would you pursue the crown or the keys to the kingdom unless you felt powerless? And then we have conflict. So the conflict is, what is the problem you need to solve to fulfill your goal? And setting plays a really important part, because different settings offer different kinds of conflict, opportunities, strength. But we as human beings must respond to that setting, and depending on the setting, and helps to shape who we become. The plot: how do you need to organize the main events in your life into an interconnected sequence? So a story always has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And our memories must always have a beginning, middle, and end. And when we are working to achieve a goal, we need a plan to get to that goal. And that main events in the story is the plot that takes place in the setting. So for example, here are some traumatic events, examples. A natural disaster. We're certainly hearing about earthquakes and hurricanes and floods and fires and things like that. We think we're okay, and then an act of God comes along and takes that all away potentially, or changes how you perceive yourself. Acts of violence, war, being assaulted, abuse. Unexpected stressful events like car crashes, divorce, injury, illness, instability, financial instability. These are things that happen outside of us that we must respond to. And then there's just a series of ordinary stressful events that can also become very traumatic. And that could be things like work job competency mismatch, poor working conditions, poor management or leadership. These are things that can cause traumas depending on how the individual responds to it. So now let's take a look at the plot template. Here's our protagonists. They begin in the ordinary world. That's called the exposition. They start in the ordinary world, minding their own business, doing their own thing, and then something happens. It's called an inciting event. But it's not just any event. It's an event that's going to change this person's trajectory of their life. And we call that, in storytelling, we call that a rising action. And this is where there's other conflicts that we have to negotiate. Other things happen along the way. Because in that rising action, we're not really quite ready for the climax at this point. We have to deal with a lot of smaller problems. And the thing about those smaller problems is that they build our skills, our knowledge, our self-awareness, because we're having to become somebody new in response to that inciting event. We have to grow as human beings in order, because what happens here is the main event unfolds in the environment, causing the conflict that the character must now solve. But then there is an internal conflict that stimulates a rising action and the climax inside of us. And this is really important. It's not the traumatic event. Of course, that's important, but it's how I, as the protagonist, respond to that rising action and climax that matters. So here we're in our rising action, and then we come to the climax. And Joseph Campbell, a very famous mythologist, made the comment that the climax is the cave of our fears. And it is in the cave of our fears that our greatest treasure lies. Well, nobody's just going to go rushing into your cave of your fears. You have to prepare for it and get ready. And this is what the rising action does, is it gets you ready for that. You're also going to look for ways to avoid it as well. But eventually, in order to get to that treasure, you're going to have to go into your cave of fears. And this is often depicted in stories as, say, a forest or a cave. And we go in, we face our fears, we get our treasures, and then we leave with the bounty of our treasure. We now have it, and we step out into the sunlight. And we're not talking about any Disney story here. We're talking about ancient myths, stories that have lasted a long time. And so when the protagonist now has gone into the cave of their fears and found their treasure, they're now the hero. They're the hero in their story, and they have the treasure, and they step into the sunlight, and the treasure turns to dust. And that brings us to the falling action. And this is what Joseph Campbell called the boon. This is where we realize it's not about the treasure. It's not about the prince or princess. It's not about the cure. It's not about the keys to the kingdom. Those things really do not make us feel powerful or loved and worthy or financially comfortable. Those are the things that come from inside of ourselves. This is where we find the true bounty is actually in the boon or the falling action. And then finally, in the denouement is French for the untangling. And this is where we untangle all of the lessons that we have learned on our journey, and we weave it back into our story so that we can return to the ordinary world, not as the same person we were, but as something more, than what we were when we started on this journey. So the mind's normal response to trauma is to weave the trauma into your story and allow that trauma to actually change who we are, to grow through that trauma. And as we are going through that and we begin to understand and we begin to make meaning of that, we form a memory. And then the memory is filed away in our minds. But trauma occurs when the mind can't form the memory, cannot make meaning out of it and form a memory. So the mind is then left to re-experience that trauma over and over and over again. So what that looks like on here is there is an inciting event that's traumatic, that otherwise, why is somebody going to change their life? The event changes their life. But if they can't find the meaning, they remain in the cave of their fears. And they cannot complete the story of the falling action and the denouement. So unresolved trauma that is being played again and again, or stuck, they're stuck in that cave of fears. And then the falling action is where they're able to now make sense. We often see in the falling action of a story, and it's often literal, that the hero and their group of champions that they have formed through their journey are sitting around a campfire, talking about the exploits. What did they learn? What did they gain? And they're reviewing the story. And then that denouement is when this mess of an experience that's running around their head finds its line and it finds order. And then they're able to set the memory behind and take what they've learned, forget about the event, not that they've completely forgotten it, but they don't have to replay it in their head over and over again. But they're able to extract what they learned and apply it in other situations, which is exactly what a coach of an athletic team does. Replay it correctly, and then forget the failure and remember the learning. So the denouement helps to organize the coaching, trauma-informed coaching, helps to organize the main events of the plot or a coaching plan. It processes emotions, it cultivates meaning making, it generates and opens up intrinsic motivation, and it encourages goal achievement, performance, and it completes that falling action and denouement. Now, that gives you a brief understanding of what we do. As soon as I figure out how to stop my sharing here. Where I can't find, oh, there we go. So now, how do we use this trauma-informed coaching? Trauma-informed coaching, first of all, you have to have a very specific structure. And then we use many storytelling techniques. We never ask somebody, what is your trauma? We use many storytelling techniques to open up the person's thinking and imagination and using their imagination to help them process their emotions and their thoughts to put things in order. Oftentimes people say, coaching's about the future, therapy's about the past. To a degree, I see where that comes from, except a coach does go back I like the word Sankofa. We train the word Sankofa, which is an African untranslatable word, which means we go to the past to fetch what we need for the future. So as coaches, we don't actually go to the past. The client chooses to go to the past for what they need for the future. So how we apply this training that we do, for example, our Veterans Talking to Veterans program is we train veterans and family members with the skill set to work with veterans and family members. And that particular program is run by the Veterans Commission. We also apply it in school districts. So trauma-informed coaching is a great place for schools because, again, we're focused on performance, goal achievement, intrinsic motivation, and making transitions. And why this is such a good partner for therapy is that there are different set of code of ethics that coaches are held to. It's very similar to a therapist, but they have an easier time of going into the community or an office space or other more public spaces that a therapist really can't go into. And so coaches, our coaching training focuses on health and wellness, but it also focuses on things like financial well-being that therapists are not really trained in unless they have a specific interest to it. So our style of coaching can help get to those causes of why people become suicidal in a different way than a therapist is trained to do. So it is complementary, and how they stay in scope of practice is that they are trained to make those referrals, those warm handoffs, but not just make the warm handoffs, but it is, what is your goal? How will you remain calm as you make the transition of reaching out to that referral? And then the follow-up with them as well. So they are good partners with other professionals. We don't really have people sliding out of scope of practice because they have a lot of tools and techniques. So our trauma-informed coaches provide a resource for therapists that are impacted because they can take certain kinds of clients that don't have some of the deep needs that they need from a therapist because they're a thinking partner and can help them adjust, just make that transition to the next step. So that's a quick overview of trauma-informed coaching. Do you have any questions?
Everyone, please feel free to unmute, ask a question, put something in the chat if you like. Dr. Quintero?
Yeah, thank you, Julie. I really appreciate your presentation, and it's really interesting and important work. Just to let you know where I'm coming from a little bit, I'm an anthropologist. I study health and healing, really interested in like illness narratives and like the therapeutic potential of illness narratives. You know, Arthur Kleinman has been a big influence in the way I think about some of those things. And I see a lot of parallels in what you're talking about. And, you know, a lot of interesting activity in medical anthropology. Um, I'm wondering, you know, I appreciate like the structure you're talking about, and I really appreciate your references to Joseph Campbell, and it reminds me about like some of a lot of the ways we think about this. There's sort of like this universal sort of like structure and plot to narratives. Um, but I'm wondering how do you think about like cultural variations within that general universal structure and how those might be important in informing your work and others' work in terms of the coaching you're talking about?
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to that. And we use a lot of anthropology in this, in our work, because, you know, when you go look for the fireplace, right, is such an important part in anthropology. And often what do you see right next to it is, you know, drawings on a wall. Why did we do that? Why did we do that? It's such a, you know, early stage of our development. And my personal belief is this is how we processed, and how we made sense and made meaning of it. So we use a lot of creative arts, our storytelling, as well. And so especially really beautiful, you know, art that stands the test of time. That art tells a story, and that it means something because we all can read into that story. So one of the things we use, one of our techniques, we teach both group coaching, team coaching, and individual coaching. And the group coaching and individual coaching is at the level 1. We use ancient myths, and they are very carefully crafted stories that we choose for a very specific reason, and we choose them from all over the world because they've lasted for thousands of years. We only tell a little bit, and then we ask very carefully crafted questions. And so because we're not imposing our bias on that, it's, you know, it's the story that's asking the question. The coach's job is to hold that space. And when you tell a story, you create what's called the storytelling trance, which is that altered state, just like a meditation, for example. And your body needs to be in that state. The parasympathetic nervous system has to be engaged for the body to be able to heal. So when you're telling a story, it's not about the story itself. I'll just never forget one of the veterans, when we went to one of the meetings, one of the veterans said, you know, I can hardly wait to hear next week's installment of this story. And it's not just that he wanted to hear the story, because he went on to say, I really want to see what Kim and Andy have to say about this story. So when they're engaging, the story stimulates the storytelling trance. And then people begin to talk about the story. We begin with what resonates with you. What did you hear in the story? That's a really important piece, because the coach is listening to how each person listened in the story. So it's healing because they open their perspective and don't feel isolated and alone. And they feel supported when somebody says, you know, I never thought about it that way. They don't even have to agree, but they've now opened their point of view. The other thing it does is it restores our social intelligence, because it happens just like this, so quickly. They don't interrupt each other. They listen intently. All these beautiful social skills come out that are getting lost in our society. So that spills into the rest of their lives. We had a PBS special called State of Mind in the Inside Battle. And I had been working with this wonderful filmmaker. He was going to come in and interview and film one of our groups. And I've been telling him, he's busy, and I've been telling him this is what we do. So after it was all over and he saw the whole thing, I said, okay, what did you think? Because I could tell he didn't get it at first. And he turned around and he said, you know, when you said you were telling an ancient story, I thought you were telling stories like, you know, the Iliad, you know, the Odyssey, a good warrior story to these warriors. And when you told a story about witches and princesses, and you got Vietnam veterans opening up, talking about what it was like to come home from Vietnam, nobody asked them, but the story inspired and opened them up to talk about it. It was an incredible moment. And that's what story does. It opens us up, it's safe, and it allows, I can't talk about the story without talking about myself.
I appreciate that. And that reminds me, I don't know if you're familiar with Teresa O'Neill's work with like Lakota veterans. And I mean, one thing she says that I think is important is like the social context of sharing stories is very important to like any sort of therapeutic potential. In other words, like if you're telling a story within like a social unit that you've grown up in, for instance, where there's multiple generations, children, siblings, parents, grandchildren, to tell a story in that context, you could tell the same story in like I don't want to say a clinical context, but like a more structured therapeutic context, which it sounds like what you're doing, which is fine. But it seems like there might be an important difference in that sort of context in terms of like therapeutic potential. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, as a therapist, I can use that this method, but I ask different questions. There are questions that we are very strict in teaching coaches. You cannot ask these kinds of questions. In fact, because a lot of times, so our method, veterans, teachers, Hollywood, we have a lot of Hollywood types of people who come and take our program because it really helps you get so deeply in touch with storytelling. So there's a lot of different areas of application. And when I'm as a therapist, I can ask rather penetrating questions because of the training as a therapist and how to hold space when somebody's working through the symptoms of depression and anxiety and things like that. Our coaches, we don't train our coaches how to use the story in that way. They have to use it with a coaching structure, and they're very specific. They're given a script to work from. They don't have to use, they pick and choose. It's very dynamic, but they are working from a script, so they know that they are asking these powerful questions, and they go off script, but their training for how to ask questions is very, very strict.
Thank you.
And if it emerges that somebody needs therapy in the group, they're trained to make the recommendations. So in our Veterans Talking to Veterans program, in Wyoming, we have about 3 to 4 average interventions, suicide interventions a month. But we don't consider ourselves the intervening at that level. What they do is they know how to get them into the help that they need. They are trained in that. But those referrals, that's an important piece of their job, is to get people into the financial counselors or financial advisors, the VA, therapy. And their job is so full. We don't have, they don't have a need to like follow them into and be therapeutic. They know that's their job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? Well, I have one, Julie. So as a therapist, and I'm thinking of, TFCBT, child and family traumatic stress intervention, things like that, there are specific kind of screen in or rule out categories for individuals that are appropriate for those things. Are there such things for the technique that you're talking about today? Like exclusionary types of criteria or anything like that?
It depends on what somebody's doing with the program. We also have, like, for example, have coaching games and things like that. So one of the Veterans Talking to Veterans is run as almost like an AA group. So people can come and drop in for the day just for that one event, or they can, a lot of times people stay for years in the group because they love the storytelling. They get very attached to people. So it's not really intended to do that kind of screening. However, they are trained, and this is part of the credentialing process too, that if they go on to be credentialed, they have to take exams to understand, what are the warning signs for both chronic illness, but also mental health as well. So they would refer out for those things.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Our
Other-
financial, go ahead.
No, I was just asking for questions.
I was also going to share that the financial well-being portion of our program, a lot in the early days, people would go, I'm not interested in working with people's finances. But then they get into it and they love it because it's about the story. It's not about knowing, you can't advise somebody about your finances, but you can set goals. You can help them with follow through some of those things. But they are storytelling methods of helping people get in touch with the stories that they are telling themselves around it. So I think this is an important point of view of when we look at suicide prevention, that we're looking at also, how do we create thriving so people don't want to become, so they're not becoming suicidal.
Thank you. Okay, anyone else? All right. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Elledge, for joining us today. Super interesting. Would it be okay if folks contact you with questions or more interest after the presentation if things pop up like they often do?
Absolutely. My email is julie@mentoragility.com.
Okay, and if folks don't remember that, you can find me at the School of Public and Community Health Sciences, and I would be happy to pass on Dr. Elledge's information.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm just thrilled to be here today.
Excellent, thank you. And everyone, next week is the observance of Veterans Day, so we will not have a seminar next week, but you will get an invitation for the week after that, and that'll be our final seminar for the academic semester, and then we'll be picking things back up in the spring. Dr. Chase Begay will tell us more about this, but we're working on a focus that will be on specifically Indigenous research methods, and he's already working on bringing people in to talk about that subject. So thanks again. This will be recorded and on our YouTube page for the school if anyone would like to tell others about Dr. Elledge's important work. So thank you very much.
Thank you.